The rain came down like a verdict. Mara Lennox stood outside the glass tower on Fifth Avenue, her worn coat pulled tight against the October wind, watching the city move around her like she wasn't even there. New York had a way of making you invisible when you stopped being useful. She'd learned that the hard way, watching her father's construction company collapse under mountains of debt, watching their modest home in Queens get foreclosed, watching her mother's hands shake as she counted pennies for groceries. 26 years old, and Mara had become an expert in disappearing. The lobby doors opened with a mechanical whisper, and she stepped inside, her reflection fragmenting across polished marble. She barely recognized herself anymore. The girl who'd dreamed of opening an art studio had been buried under hospital bills and collection notices. What remained was someone harder, quieter, someone who'd learned that survival meant swallowing your pride and accepting terms you'd never imagined. The elevator climbed 47 floors in silence. Adrian Cross. The name alone carried weight in Manhattan. Real estate empire, tech investments, a portfolio that stretched across 3 continents. Forbes had called him the architect of modern luxury. The tabloids called him cold, untouchable, a man who turned everything he touched into gold but had never been photographed smiling. Mara had seen him exactly once at a charity gala where she'd been working coat check to help pay her mother's medication costs. He'd walked past her without looking, surrounded by assistants and lawyers, moving through the world like he owned the very air people breathed. Now she was about to marry him. The contract had arrived 3 weeks ago, delivered by a lawyer with expensive shoes and a face that betrayed nothing. Adrian Cross needed a wife, for appearances, for business deals that required the optics of stability, for investors who trusted married men more than bachelors. The arrangement would last 18 months. She would attend functions, pose for photographs, play the role of devoted spouse in public while maintaining complete separation in private. In exchange, every debt her family owed would vanish. Her father's medical bills from the heart attack that had started everything. The predatory loans her mother had taken trying to save their home. The credit card companies circling like vultures. All of it. Erased. The elevator doors opened onto a penthouse office that seemed to float above the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed Manhattan like a painting. The Hudson River, a ribbon of steel in the distance. Everything here spoke of power held so casually, it didn't need to announce itself. Adrian stood with his back to her, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in clipped sentences about market projections and acquisition timelines. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that probably cost more than her family's monthly rent. His dark hair was slightly too long for corporate convention, touching his collar in a way that suggested he didn't care what anyone thought. He ended the call without goodbye and turned. Mara had prepared herself for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the actual weight of his attention. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray, distant, analytical. They moved over her with the same dispassion he might assess a property investment, cataloging and dismissing in the same breath. "Miss Lennox." His voice carried the flat efficiency of someone who measured time in millions. "You're early. I thought punctuality mattered in business arrangements." She kept her voice steady, refusing to let him see how her heart hammered against her ribs. Something flickered across his expression. Surprise, maybe, or curiosity quickly suppressed. "Sit." She took the chair across from his desk, a modernist piece of steel and glass that felt more like an interrogation table than furniture. The contract sat between them, thick as a novel, every clause designed to ensure this marriage remained exactly what it was: a transaction. My lawyers have explained the terms. Adrian didn't sit. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, silhouetting himself against the cityscape like he was part of it. You'll maintain residence in the guest wing of my home in Tribeca. We'll attend functions together as needed, 12 to 15 events over the contract period. You'll be compensated monthly, with the bulk payment clearing your family's debts upon signing. I read the contract. Mara met his eyes, refusing to be reduced to a line item. All 73 pages. Then you understand this is purely professional. We're not friends. We're not lovers. We're business partners engaged in mutual benefit. The words should have hurt, but Mara had learned to build walls around hurt. She'd spent the last 3 years watching everything she loved slip away. This was just another form of loss, the death of whatever naive dreams she'd once held about marriage, love, the fairy tale ending. I understand perfectly, Mr. Cross. Adrian. He turned from the window, studying her with that unreadable gaze. If you're going to pretend to be my wife, you should probably use my first name. Adrian, she repeated, testing the shape of it. It felt strange in her mouth, too intimate for what this was. He moved to the desk, producing an elegant pen that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. Any questions before we formalize this? Mara thought of her mother, sitting in their one-bedroom apartment in Astoria, trying to decide between buying groceries or paying the electric bill. She thought of her father, 6 months dead from the stress that had stopped his heart, buried in a grave they could barely afford. She thought of all the doors that had closed in her face when she'd begged for help, for time, for mercy. Just one, she said quietly. Why me? You could have found someone from your own world, someone who'd fit better into all this. She gestured at the office, the city beyond, the empire he'd built. For the first time, Adrian's expression shifted, something almost human crossing his features before the mask returned. Because everyone in my world wants something beyond money. They want access, connections, a permanent place in this life. You just want to save your family. When the contract ends, you'll walk away, clean, simple, no complications. He was right, of course. Mara had no illusions about belonging here. This world of private jets and penthouse views wasn't hers. It would never be hers. She was just borrowing it long enough to survive. Then we understand each other. She took the pen he offered, her hand steadier than she'd expected. The signature took seconds. Her name, Mara Lennox, written in blue ink that would bind her to this man, this arrangement, this carefully constructed fiction for the next 18 months. Adrian signed without hesitation, his own signature a sharp slash across the page, and just like that, it was done. The wedding is scheduled for Friday, he said, already turning back to his computer as if she'd ceased to exist. City Hall, 2 p.m. My assistant will send details. Dress appropriately. There will be photographers. Mara stood, the contract feeling heavy in her hands even though it weighed nothing. What should I tell people about us, about how we met? Tell them we met through mutual friends, that it was love at first sight. His voice carried a trace of something that might have been irony. People believe what they want to believe, Miss Lennox, especially when it comes to fairy tales. She walked to the elevator on legs that felt numb. The city spread out below her like a promise and a threat. Somewhere in this vast machinery of wealth and power, she'd just sold something she couldn't quite name. Not her body. The contract was clear on that. Not even her dignity, exactly. Maybe just the last small piece of herself that had still believed in magic. The elevator descended, and Mara watched her reflection in the polished doors. A woman in a second-hand coat who'd just agreed to marry a stranger, to play pretend in a world that would never accept her, to trade 18 months of her life for her family's survival. The doors opened onto Fifth Avenue, and the rain had stopped. The city gleamed wet and clean, indifferent to the bargains people made in its towers. Mara pulled her coat tighter and walked into the October afternoon, carrying the weight of what she'd just done, the contract pressed against her chest like a secret she'd have to learn to live with. Behind her, 47 floors up, Adrian Cross stood at his window and watched her small figure disappear into the crowd. He told himself he felt nothing, that this was just another deal, another transaction in a life built on them. That the moment she'd looked at him with those honey-brown eyes and refused to flinch, that moment meant nothing at all. He turned back to his desk, to the empire that required constant feeding, constant attention, and tried to ignore the strange quiet that had settled in the room after she left. The wedding took 11 minutes. City Hall smelled like bureaucracy and old wood, its marble hallways echoing with the footsteps of other couples getting married on their lunch breaks. Mara wore the only dress she owned that wasn't fraying at the seams, a simple cream shift she'd bought at a consignment shop in Park Slope. No veil, no flowers, no guests, except Adrian's lawyer and a photographer whose job was to document the fiction. Adrian arrived exactly on time, wearing a charcoal suit and an expression that suggested he was checking items off a list. Meeting at 9 a.m. with Tokyo investors, check. Approve the new development in Brooklyn. Check. Marry a woman he barely knew. Check. You look nice, he said, and it sounded like an observation rather than a compliment. Thank you. Mara adjusted the thin gold bracelet she'd worn, her grandmother's, the only piece of jewelry that hadn't been sold off during the worst of it. It felt important to have something real with her, even in this orchestrated moment. The officiant was a tired woman in her 50s who'd probably married 200 couples that month alone. She read the vows with the enthusiasm of someone reciting a grocery list, pausing only to prompt them for their responses. Do you, Adrian James Cross, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. No hesitation, no emotion, just words spoken into air that meant nothing. Do you, Mara Elizabeth Lennox, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Mara looked at Adrian, at this stranger who held her family's future in his hands, and felt the surreal weight of what was happening. This wasn't marriage. It was performance art, a legal document dressed up in tradition's clothes. I do. The rings were platinum, simple, expensive. Adrian slid hers on with mechanical precision, his fingers cool against her skin. When it was her turn, she noticed his hands for the first time, strong, scarred on the knuckles like he'd built something physical once, not just paper empires. You may kiss the bride. Adrian hesitated for the first time all morning, something unreadable crossing his face. Then he leaned in and pressed his lips to hers, brief, perfunctory, the kind of kiss you'd give a distant relative at a funeral. It lasted maybe 3 seconds and contained absolutely nothing except obligation. The photographer captured it anyway. Click, click, click. Evidence for the world that this was real. They signed the certificate in silence. Mrs. Mara Cross. The name looked alien on paper, like it belonged to someone else entirely. Congratulations, the officiant said without conviction. May you have a long and happy marriage. Adrian's car waited outside, a black Mercedes with tinted windows that whispered wealth. His driver opened the door without speaking, and Mara slid into leather seats that probably cost more than everything she owned combined. The partition between front and back rose automatically, sealing them in expensive silence. "We have a dinner tonight," Adrian said, scrolling through his phone like she wasn't there. "The Carlisle, 8 p.m. Investors from Singapore interested in the Hudson Yards project. You'll need to change." "I don't have anything appropriate for the Carlisle." The words came out harder than she'd intended, but Mara was tired of pretending she belonged in this world. He glanced up, and for a moment she saw something almost like comprehension cross his features. "My assistant had clothing sent to the house. Several options. Wear whatever fits." "I don't need charity." "It's not charity." His voice flattened. "It's logistics. You represent my interests now. That requires a certain presentation." The car glided through Tribeca, past converted warehouses and boutique hotels, stopping finally at a building that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of stone. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor, 4,000 square feet of exposed brick, vaulted ceilings, and windows that framed the city like artwork. "Your rooms are through there." Adrian gestured to a corridor leading west. "I'm in the east wing. We share common spaces, kitchen, living room, respect each other's privacy. My schedule is unpredictable, so don't expect regular meals or social interaction." "Understood." Mara watched him shrug off his jacket, revealing shoulders that didn't match the corporate profile. He moved like someone who understood physical labor, not just leverage and arbitrage. "The staff," he started, then paused. "There is no staff. I don't keep live-in help. A cleaning service comes twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays. Otherwise, it's just us." Something about that surprised her. She'd expected a small army of people managing his life. But the penthouse, for all its luxury, felt curiously empty. "I'll stay out of your way," Mara said quietly. Adrian looked at her then, really looked, for the first time since they'd signed the papers. His eyes, that stormy gray, held something she couldn't name. "You don't have to disappear. This is your home now, for 18 months at least." Then he walked to his wing of the penthouse and closed the door behind him, leaving Mara standing in a living room that could have fit her entire childhood home inside it. Her rooms were beautiful in that impersonal way. Expensive hotels are beautiful, perfectly decorated, utterly soulless. King bed with white linens, abstract art on the walls that said nothing, a bathroom done in Italian marble with a shower big enough for 4 people, and on the bed, garment bags. At least 20 of them. Mara unzipped the first one and found a cocktail dress in deep emerald silk, designer label, her exact size. The second held navy with delicate beading. The third, black with architectural lines that would photograph perfectly. Her throat tightened. She knew these weren't gifts, they were costumes for the role she'd agreed to play. But touching the fabric, soft, expensive, beautiful, reminded her of the girl she'd been before everything fell apart. The girl who'd sketched fashion designs in the margins of her notebooks, who'd dreamed of creating something lovely instead of just surviving. That girl felt very far away now. Mara chose the emerald dress for dinner. It fit like it had been made for her, which it probably had, based on measurements Adrian's assistant must have acquired somehow. She looked at herself in the mirror, hair she'd styled with drugstore products, a face she'd learned to keep carefully blank, a body wrapped in silk that cost more than her last 3 months of rent combined. She looked like she belonged, but belonging was just another lie this marriage was built on. Adrian was waiting in the living room when she emerged, changed into a different suit, this one midnight blue. He glanced up from his phone, and something shifted in his expression. A flicker of what? Surprise? Approval? It vanished before she could name it. "You look appropriate," he said. "High praise," Mara replied dryly. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close enough to suggest something human lived under that armor. The Carlyle was everything Mara had imagined wealthy people's New York to be. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, waiters who moved like dancers. Adrian's guests were already seated, 2 men in expensive suits, 1 older woman with perfect silver hair and jewelry that could fund a college education. "Adrian!" The older man stood, handshake firm. "And this must be your bride. We were so surprised by the news." "Surprised, but delighted," the woman added, her eyes scanning Mara with the precision of an appraiser evaluating a painting. "How did you 2 meet?" Adrian's hand found the small of Mara's back, warm, steady, completely unexpected. "Mutual friends," he said smoothly, "though I'd argue it was fate. Sometimes you just know." Mara smiled and let him spin the lie. She played her part perfectly, laughing at the right moments, asking polite questions about Singapore and development timelines, touching Adrian's arm when it seemed appropriate. They were selling something here, not just a business deal, but the idea that Adrian Cross was the kind of man who could love, who had something beyond balance sheets and acquisition strategies. And somehow, impossibly, the investors believed it. "You've changed him," the woman, Mrs. Chen, said during a moment when the men were discussing zoning regulations. "Adrian's always been brilliant, but cold, unreachable. But tonight?" She smiled. "Tonight, he seems almost happy." Mara wanted to laugh. Adrian wasn't happy. He was acting just like she was. They were both performers in a play only they knew was fiction. But when she glanced at him across the table, explaining something about sustainable architecture with unusual passion, she wondered if maybe there were parts of Adrian Cross he kept hidden even from himself. Parts that had nothing to do with the empire he'd built or the wealth he'd accumulated. The dinner lasted 3 hours. By the end, the Singapore investors were ready to sign. Adrian walked them to their car with promises to finalize contracts by month's end. "You did well," he said in the Mercedes on the way home. The partition was down, driver silent and invisible. "Thank you." Mara felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. Playing someone else's wife, even for an evening, required a kind of energy she didn't know she possessed. "Mrs. Chen liked you. She's notoriously difficult to impress. Maybe she just wanted to believe the fairy tale." Adrian turned to look at her, the city lights sliding across his face in patterns of shadow and gold. "Maybe. Or maybe you're better at this than you thought." They rode the elevator up to the penthouse in silence. The door closed behind them, sealing them into their separate wings, their separate lives, this elaborate pretense they'd agreed to maintain. Mara changed out of the emerald dress and hung it carefully in the closet with all the others. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, watching lights flicker in 1,000 buildings where real people lived real lives. Somewhere out there, her mother was probably asleep in the 1-bedroom apartment that would soon be paid for, free of debt for the first time in years. That was real. That mattered. Everything else, this penthouse, the dress, the wedding ring on her finger, was just scaffolding around a transaction. But as Mara finally climbed into bed, she found herself thinking about Adrian's hand on her back during dinner. How steady it had been. How real it had felt, even though nothing between them was real at all. Mara woke to silence so complete it felt like falling. The penthouse absorbed sound, swallowed it, left nothing but the muted hum of climate control and the distant whisper of traffic 40 stories below. She lay in the enormous bed, watching dawn paint the windows gold, and tried to remember who she was supposed to be today. Adrian's wife, Mrs. Cross, a woman who belonged in rooms like this. The lies stacked up so neatly, it was almost beautiful. She found him in the kitchen at 6 a.m., standing at the marble island with espresso and a tablet, scrolling through what looked like architectural renderings. He wore running clothes, fitted black, expensive, the kind athletes wore when performance mattered. Without the armor of his suits, he looked younger, more human, though no less guarded. "Coffee's fresh," he said without looking up. "Cups are above the machine." Mara poured herself a cup, grateful for something to do with her hands. The kitchen was pristine, barely used, like everything here existed more as concept than reality. "Do you run?" she asked, then immediately regretted it. They weren't supposed to make small talk. This wasn't that kind of arrangement. But Adrian glanced at her, and something in his expression softened microscopically. "Every morning, 6 miles, usually along the Hudson, clears my head. I used to run, in high school, track and field." The words came out before she could stop them, before she remembered she was supposed to keep herself locked away. "Why'd you stop?" "Because my father had a heart attack, and everything ended. Because survival doesn't leave time for things like joy. Because I became someone who couldn't afford to want anything beyond making it through the day." "Life," Mara said simply. Adrian nodded like he understood. "You can join me, if you want. I leave at 6:15. It wasn't an invitation, exactly. More like stating a fact. But something in Mara, some stubborn piece that refused to completely disappear, wanted to say yes. "Maybe," she said. "Sometime." He returned to his renderings, the conversation clearly over. Mara took her coffee to the windows and watched the city wake up. Delivery trucks and taxis and thousands of people beginning their ordinary lives. From this height, everyone looked small, insignificant, like pieces in some vast game they didn't know they were playing. "We have an event tonight," Adrian said, breaking the silence. "Fundraiser at the Met, black tie. We need to arrive by 7:30. "What's it for?" Mara was learning to ask questions, to treat this like the job it was. Children's literacy programs, it's good optics, shows I care about something besides profit margins. His voice carried a trace of self-awareness, like he knew how that sounded. "Do you? Care, I mean." Adrian looked at her, really looked, and for a moment, his guard dropped completely. "I don't know anymore. I write checks because I'm supposed to. Show up because it's expected. Does that count as caring?" The honesty caught Mara off guard. She'd expected him to be one-dimensional, the cold billionaire, the heartless businessman. But there was something underneath the armor, something uncertain and searching. "I think caring is about what you do when nobody's watching," she said quietly. "When there's no photographer, no investors to impress. What you do then, that's real." Adrian studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he set down his tablet. "I should go. Run before the day eats me alive." He left through the private elevator that went directly to the building's gym, and Mara was alone again with the silence and the city and the strange weight of whatever had just passed between them. She spent the morning unpacking, not just the clothes Adrian's assistant had provided, but the few personal things she'd brought from her old life. Books with broken spines, a sketch pad filled with fashion designs she'd never finish, a photo of her parents on their wedding day, young and hopeful, believing the world would be kind to them. It hadn't been. The world was rarely kind to people without money or power or connections. Around noon, Mara's phone rang. Her mother. "Baby, the bank called." Her mom's voice shook with emotion. "The mortgage, it's paid, The credit cards, the hospital bills, everything, all of it, gone. How did you— I found work, Mom. Good work. The lie came easily now. Mara had decided not to tell her mother about the contract marriage, not yet. Maybe not ever. Let her believe her daughter had gotten lucky, found some miracle job that paid enough to erase years of debt. What kind of work pays that much? Suspicion crept in, the way it always did with desperate people who'd learned to distrust good fortune. I'm a consultant. For a real estate company, they needed someone with my— She paused, scrambling. My organizational skills. It wasn't entirely a lie. She was consulting in a way, just not on spreadsheets and development plans. Her mother cried then, relief overwhelming the questions. I've been so scared, Mara. So scared we'd lose everything. That I'd end up on the street. That your father died for nothing. He didn't die for nothing, Mom. He loved you. That meant something. They talked for 20 more minutes, and when Mara finally hung up, she felt hollowed out. The weight of lying to the person she loved most sat heavy in her chest, but what was the alternative? Tell her the truth? That her daughter had sold herself into a pretend marriage to clean up their family's mess? Some truths were too brutal to share. That evening, Mara stood in front of her closet, if you could call it hers, and chose a black gown from the array of designer options. It was simple but stunning, with a neckline that somehow managed to be both modest and striking. She did her makeup carefully, watched tutorials on YouTube to get the eyeliner right, twisted her dark hair into something elegant. When she looked in the mirror, she saw someone else entirely. Not Mara Lennox from Queens, working 3 jobs and drowning in debt. But Mrs. Adrian Cross, socialite, wife of one of New York's most powerful men. The transformation was complete. Adrian was waiting in the living room, stunning in a tuxedo that probably cost more than a semester of college. He looked up when she entered, and this time his reaction was unmistakable. You look— He stopped himself, clearing his throat. That dress is perfect. Thank you. Mara forced herself not to fidget with her clutch. You clean up pretty well yourself. Was that almost a smile? It vanished too quickly to be sure. The Met was everything she'd expected and nothing she'd prepared for. A cathedral of wealth and culture where New York's elite gathered to feel good about themselves while writing tax-deductible checks. The great hall glowed with candlelight, classical music drifting through conversations worth millions. Adrian's hand found hers, not his usual perfunctory touch for appearances, but something steadier. Stay close, he murmured. These events can be overwhelming. If you need a break, just tell me. It was the kindest thing he'd said since their arrangement began. They moved through the crowd like dancers who'd practiced together for years. Adrian introduced her to hedge fund managers, museum board members, old money families whose names were carved into buildings. Mara smiled, made appropriate comments, played the part of devoted newlywed wife. But something happened an hour into the evening that shifted everything. A woman approached, beautiful, polished, wearing a gown that cost more than most cars. She looked at Adrian with an expression Mara recognized immediately, possession mixed with hurt. Adrian, I heard the news. Congratulations. Her voice could have frozen water. Vivian. Adrian's entire body tensed. This is unexpected. I'm on the literacy board, darling. Remember? We planned this event together. Before you— She turned to Mara, smile sharp as glass. Before you got married so suddenly. To someone none of us had ever met. Mara, this is Vivian Hartley. Vivian, my wife, Mara. The word, wife, sounded different in his mouth now, almost defensive. Vivian's eyes traveled over Mara with undisguised contempt. How modern of you, Adrian. Finding a bride from— Where did you say you were from, dear? Queens, Mara said evenly, refusing to flinch. Born and raised. How quaint. Vivian's smile never reached her eyes. Well, I hope you're prepared for this world. It eats people who don't belong, especially those who think they can play at being something they're not. Adrian stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. That's enough, Vivian. Oh, darling, I'm just being honest. Something we used to value, remember? She touched his arm, intimate, familiar. When you're ready to stop pretending, you know where to find me. She drifted away, leaving poison in her wake. Mara felt her carefully constructed composure cracking. She wasn't naive. She'd known there would be judgment, skepticism, people who could see through the fiction. But having it thrown in her face, having her inadequacy displayed so publicly, made her want to run. She's wrong, Adrian said quietly, about everything. Is she? Mara turned to him, dropping her voice so only he could hear. I don't belong here, Adrian. We both know it. I'm just a girl from Queens playing dress-up in your world. Now you think I belong here? Something raw flashed across his face. I grew up in foster care, 15 different homes before I aged out at 18. I built this. He gestured at everything around them, because I was terrified of being invisible again, of being nobody. Mara stared at him, truly seeing him for the first time. Not the billionaire or the cold businessman, but the boy underneath who'd fought his way out of nothing, who'd armored himself in wealth because he knew what it meant to have absolutely nothing. Then we're both pretending, she said softly. Maybe. Adrian's hand tightened around hers. But we're pretending together. That has to count for something. They stayed another hour, fulfilling obligations, writing the check Adrian was expected to write. But something had shifted between them, some recognition that they weren't as different as they'd believed, that they were both survivors wearing expensive clothes, playing roles, trying to convince the world they belonged in, spaces that felt fundamentally hostile. In the car ride home, Adrian broke the silence. Vivian and I dated 2 years ago. She expected a proposal. I ended things instead. You don't owe me an explanation. I know, but I want you to understand. She's bitter. She'll try to undermine you, make you feel like you don't deserve to be here. Don't I? Deserve to be here, I mean. I'm not actually your wife, Adrian. I'm a woman you're paying to pretend. He turned to look at her, the city lights sliding across his face. You signed a contract. You're fulfilling your obligations with more grace than anyone I've met in this world. That's more real than most marriages I've seen. Mara wanted to believe him. Wanted to think that maybe, somehow, this strange arrangement could become something more than transaction. But she'd learned the hard way that wanting something didn't make it true. They rode the elevator up to the penthouse, the silence between them different now, not quite comfortable, but less hostile. Less like two strangers forced together, and more like two people beginning to understand the shape of each other's loneliness. Good night, Mara, Adrian said at the entrance to his wing. Good night. She watched him disappear behind his door, then turned to her own rooms. The black gown felt heavy now, a costume she was ready to shed. She changed into her oldest pajamas, soft with too many washings, more hers than anything in this penthouse, and stood at the window watching the city breathe. Somewhere out there, Vivian Hartley was probably telling everyone who'd listen that Adrian's marriage was a sham, that his wife was a nobody from Queens who'd never truly belong. And the terrifying thing was, she wasn't wrong. But as Mara finally climbed into bed, she thought about Adrian's confession. Foster care, 15 homes, a childhood that taught him to trust nothing and no one. She thought about how he'd defended her tonight, how his hand had held hers, not like a business obligation, but like he actually cared whether she survived the evening. Maybe they were both pretending. Maybe this marriage was a carefully constructed fiction. But in the space between the lies, something true was beginning to take root, something neither of them had planned for or knew how to name, something that felt dangerously like understanding. The running started 3 days after the Met Gala. Mara woke at 5:50, pulled on clothes she hadn't worn in years, and found Adrian stretching in the living room. He looked surprised, but said nothing, just nodded toward the elevator. They ran in silence along the Hudson River path, morning fog rolling off the water like something from a dream. Mara's lungs burned. She was out of practice, out of shape, from years of survival, leaving no room for self-care. But she pushed through, matching Adrian's pace, refusing to be left behind. "You're stronger than you look," he said when they finally stopped, both breathing hard. "I've had to be." Mara wiped sweat from her face, feeling more herself than she had in months. "You don't survive what I survived by being fragile." Something shifted in Adrian's expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition. "Tell me about it. Your family. What happened?" They sat on a bench overlooking the river, and Mara found herself talking. About her father's construction company that had been crushed by a recession and corrupt contractors. About medical bills that multiplied like cancer. About watching her mother's spirit break piece by piece, loan by loan, until there was nothing left but desperation. "He died believing he'd failed us," Mara said quietly. "That's what killed him more than the heart attack. Shame." Adrian stared at the water, jaw tight. "My mother was 15 when she had me, addicted, in and out of rehab. I spent my childhood being shuffled between strangers who got paid to pretend they cared." He paused. "She died when I was 12. Overdose. I didn't even find out until 3 weeks later." Mara reached for his hand without thinking, a gesture of comfort that transcended their arrangement. Adrian looked at their joined hands like he'd forgotten what human touch felt like. "We're both refugees," she said, "from lives that tried to destroy us. Maybe that's why this works." Adrian's thumb moved across her knuckles, absent, almost tender. "We understand survival." They ran together every morning after that. Not talking much, just moving through the city as it woke, two people learning the rhythm of each other's breathing, the cadence of each other's steps. And something between them began to shift. Adrian started leaving coffee for her, made exactly how she liked it, which meant he'd been paying attention. Mara started cooking dinners, simple meals that filled the penthouse with warmth it had never known. They'd eat together sometimes, conversations stretching longer than either intended. "You're different than I expected," Adrian said one night over pasta she'd made from her grandmother's recipe. "Different how?" "Stronger, funnier, more real than anyone I've met in years." He set down his fork, studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "This arrangement was supposed to be simple. You're making it complicated. Is that a bad thing? I don't know yet." But the way he looked at her, like she was something precious he was afraid to break, suggested maybe complicated wasn't bad at all. The shift happened so gradually, Mara almost didn't notice. Adrian started coming home earlier, trading late meetings for dinners with her. They'd talk for hours about architecture and art, about dreams they'd buried and fears they couldn't name. He showed her renderings of buildings he wanted to create, structures that prioritized beauty over profit, spaces designed for people who had nothing. "I want to build something that matters," he confessed one night, wine making him vulnerable. "Not just monuments to wealth, something real." Then do it. Mara touched his face without thinking, her palm against his jaw. You have the power. Use it. Adrian caught her hand, held it there, his eyes searching hers for something he seemed afraid to find. You make me want to be better. Different. I don't know what to do with that. Maybe just let it happen, she whispered. He kissed her then, not the perfunctory wedding kiss, but something deep and desperate and terrifyingly real. Mara kissed him back, feeling walls she'd built for protection crumbling, feeling herself falling towards something she'd promised herself she wouldn't want. When they finally pulled apart, Adrian looked shaken. This wasn't supposed to happen. I know. The contract, I know. Mara stepped back, trying to rebuild her defenses even as they lay in ruins around her. We should both get some sleep. But that night, lying alone in her enormous bed, Mara knew everything had changed. This wasn't pretend anymore. Somewhere between the morning runs and quiet dinners, between confessions and coffee made with care, she'd started falling for Adrian Cross. And the most terrifying part was knowing he felt it too. The next morning, Adrian was gone. Emergency business in London, his assistant texted. No goodbye, no explanation. Just absence where partnership had begun to bloom. Mara spent 3 days alone in the penthouse, wondering if he was running from what they'd almost become. If the kiss had been a mistake that needed geographic distance to erase. When he finally returned, Adrian looked exhausted and somehow older. He found her on the terrace, watching sunset paint the city gold. I'm sorry I left without saying goodbye. His voice carried weight. I needed to think. About us. About what this is becoming. What I want it to become. He moved closer, careful, like approaching something wild. I told myself I didn't believe in love, that it was just chemistry and convenience. But then you happened. Mara's heart hammered. Adrian, I'm falling in love with you, Mara, actually genuinely falling. And it terrifies me more than anything I've built or lost. The confession hung between them like something fragile. You don't mean that, Mara said, even as hope bloomed traitorously in her chest. You can't. This was business. We agreed. I know what we agreed. Adrian's hands found her waist, gentle, asking permission. But somewhere between your stubbornness and your strength and the way you make coffee taste like home, the agreement stopped mattering. We barely know each other. I know you run even when it hurts, because quitting isn't in your vocabulary. I know you cry during commercials about rescue dogs. I know you sketch fashion designs when you think I'm not looking. Beautiful things you're too scared to show anyone. His thumb traced her cheekbone. I know the real you, not the version you show the world, the one underneath. Tears blurred Mara's vision. I'm falling too. God help me, I am. But this scares me, Adrian. People like me don't get fairy tales. Neither do people like me. But maybe together we write a different ending. He kissed her again, and this time Mara let herself fall completely. Let herself believe that maybe, impossibly, love could bloom in the strangest soil. They made love that night, not as strangers fulfilling a contract, but as two people who'd found each other in the ruins of their separate devastations. Adrian touched her like she was sacred, like every scar and doubt and beautiful broken piece of her mattered. I see you, he whispered against her skin, all of you, and you're extraordinary. Afterward, wrapped in sheets that smelled like him, Mara let herself hope. Let herself imagine a future beyond 18 months, beyond contracts and obligations. A future where they chose each other every day. But morning brought reality crashing back. Vivian's interview appeared in page 6, a carefully orchestrated character assassination. Photos of Mara before the marriage, looking exhausted and poor. Details about her family's debts, her father's failed business, the desperation that led her to Adrian. Gold digger or genius, the headline screamed. Inside Adrian Cross's contract marriage to a nobody from Queens. Adrian found Mara on the terrace, the article pulled up on her phone, tears streaming down her face. "Hey," he pulled her close. "This is Vivian being vindictive. It doesn't matter." "It does matter. She's not wrong, Adrian. I did marry you for money, to save my family. That's the truth. That was the truth, past tense." He tilted her face up, fierce and certain. "What we have now, that's real. The rest is just noise." But doubt had planted itself deep. How could Mara be sure Adrian loved her for herself, not just the idea of saving someone broken? How could he be sure she wasn't just a better actress than Vivian gave her credit for? "I need time," Mara whispered, "to think, to figure out if this is real or just Stockholm Syndrome dressed up as romance." Adrian flinched like she'd struck him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe we moved too fast. Maybe we need distance to see clearly." "Distance?" His voice went cold, the businessman returning, walls rebuilding. "Fine. I have meetings in Tokyo next week. I'll be gone 10 days. Use that time to decide what you want." He left the terrace, and Mara heard his door slam. The sound echoed through the penthouse, final as a verdict. She stood watching the city as morning broke, wondering if she'd just destroyed the best thing that had ever happened to her, or saved herself from a beautiful lie she'd wanted too desperately to believe. 10 days felt like 10 years. Mara spent them wandering the penthouse like a ghost, questioning everything. Was love real when it grew from a transaction? Could something genuine bloom in soil poisoned by contracts and necessity? She visited her mother, who looked healthier than she had in years, color in her cheeks, hope in her eyes. "You seem sad, baby," her mom said. "Is everything okay with work?" Mara almost laughed. "Work? If only it were that simple." "I think I'm in love with someone I shouldn't love," she confessed. Her mother took her hand. "Your father and I started with nothing. People said we'd never make it. Too young, too poor, too foolish. But we chose each other every single day. That's what love is, Mara. Not how it starts, but what you do with it." The words settled something in Mara's chest. She spent the next 3 days preparing, called Adrian's assistant for access to his private files, found the architectural renderings he'd shown her, buildings designed for beauty, not profit, projects he'd never greenlit because they weren't financially sound, and she made a decision. When Adrian returned from Tokyo, exhausted and guarded, he found Mara in his office. On his desk, detailed proposals for 3 community housing projects incorporating his designs, financial models proving they could work, partnerships with non-profits she'd spent 72 hours researching. "What is this?" His voice was careful, uncertain. "Your dream. The buildings that matter." Mara stood, meeting his eyes. "I spent 10 days deciding if what we have is real. And I realized, real isn't about how something starts. It's about what you build together." Adrian stared at the proposals, then at her, something breaking open in his expression. "You did this? For me?" "With you. If you want me." He crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling her close. "I want you. God, Mara, I want you. Not the contract, not the arrangement, just you. Then we start over. No more pretending." "No more pretending," he agreed, and kissed her like a promise. The first community housing project broke ground in Brooklyn 3 months later. Mara stood beside Adrian at the ceremony, no longer playing a role, but living one. Partner, collaborator, the woman who'd helped him remember why he'd wanted to build in the first place. "You changed everything," Adrian said that night in their bedroom. No longer separate wings, but a shared space they'd created together. "Made me remember I wanted to matter, not just accumulate." "You did that yourself." "I just reminded you." They'd dissolved the contract 2 months prior, replacing it with something infinitely more fragile and more real: actual marriage, the kind built on choice, not obligation. Mara had started her own business, a sustainable fashion line employing women from struggling backgrounds, teaching them design and manufacturing. Adrian funded it, but she ran it, pouring her deferred dreams into something tangible and beautiful. "Mrs. Chen asked about you yesterday," Adrian mentioned, pulling her close. "Said you were the best thing that ever happened to me." "What did you tell her?" "That she was right." He kissed her temple. "That I was dying before you. I just didn't know it. You brought me back to life." Vivian had faded into irrelevance, her bitterness unable to compete with what Adrian and Mara had built. The society pages still occasionally speculated about their unusual romance, but they'd stopped caring what anyone thought. They had morning runs, quiet dinners, conversations that stretched until dawn. They had arguments and reconciliations, failures and triumphs, all the messy, beautiful reality of actual love. "I'm pregnant," Mara told him on a Tuesday in November, 1 year after they'd signed the contract that had brought them together. Adrian's face transformed, joy so pure it made her chest ache. "Really?" "Really. Are you ready for this?" He pulled her into his arms, and Mara felt his tears against her hair. "I've been ready since the moment you refused to disappear, since you showed me that love isn't what you start with, it's what you become together." The baby arrived in July, a girl with Adrian's gray eyes and Mara's stubborn chin. They named her Hope. Standing in the hospital room, watching Adrian hold their daughter with terrified reverence, Mara thought about the woman she'd been 18 months ago. Desperate, drowning, convinced fairy tales were lies told to make poverty bearable. She'd been wrong. Not about fairy tales being simple. They weren't. Real love was complicated, built from compromise and choice and showing up even when it was hard. But magic existed. Not the kind in storybooks, but the kind that happened when two broken people decided to heal together. "What are you thinking?" Adrian asked, catching her watching them. "That I'd sign that contract again, every time, because it led here. To a screaming infant who hasn't let us sleep in 3 days?" But he was smiling, exhausted and happy and more real than the man she'd married at City Hall. To this, us, a family built from nothing. They'd created something impossible, a marriage that began as transaction and became transformation. Adrian's empire had shifted focus, prioritizing community development and sustainable design. Mara's fashion line employed 50 women, giving them skills and dignity and second chances. Her mother visited weekly, playing grandmother with fierce joy. She knew the truth now, about the contract, the arrangement, how it had all begun. "I'm not mad," she'd said. "You saved us. But more than that, you saved yourself." On Hope's first birthday, they held a small party in the community center attached to Adrian's first housing project. Neighbors brought food. Children played in the courtyard Adrian had designed with climbing structures and gardens, and Mara felt something settle in her chest. Belonging. Not because of money or status, but because they'd built something meaningful. Because they'd chosen each other, every single day, even when it was terrifying. "Do you ever regret it?" Mara asked Adrian that night, Hope finally asleep between them. "That it started the way it did?" "Never." He laced his fingers through hers. "Every path led here. To you. To her. To understanding that love isn't about deserving. It's about deciding. We decided each other. That's the only fairy tale that matters." Mara kissed him, tasting truth and coffee and home. She'd signed a contract marriage coldly, believing she was selling herself to survive. But somewhere between obligation and choice, between performance and reality, she'd discovered something precious. True beauty wasn't what the world saw. It was what you built when no one was watching. It was morning runs and quiet dinners and loving someone despite fear, not because of certainty. It was Adrian seeing past her desperation to her strength. It was Mara recognizing his loneliness and offering belonging. It was two people from nothing creating everything. Outside, New York glittered with 1,000 stories. People struggling and surviving, loving and losing, building lives from whatever materials they could find. Inside, a small family slept. Contract dissolved, love remaining, proof that sometimes the coldest beginnings could lead to the warmest endings. Not because fairy tales were real, but because people were. Complicated, broken, beautiful people who chose each other anyway. And that, Mara understood finally, was the truest magic of all.